next speaker we have for today is Safae Bourhnane. She's HPC Researcher at Fraunhofer SCAI. And she's going to talk about the streaming, HPC data workflows, cloud SQL databases at scale for metadata. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Safae Bourhnane, and I am a researcher at Fraunhofer SCAI in St. Augustine, Germany. And today I will be presenting, this is actually an extension of my poster, which will be in display in the ISC next week, part of the Women in HPC poster session. And this is bringing me to say a huge thank you to the HPC KP organizers, as well as Women in HPC, for financing my travels and allowing me to be here among these brilliant minds and talk to you about an extended version of my poster. So yeah, if you're going to be in the ISC next week, it will be great to catch up with you all again. Yeah, so as you can see from the title, I will be trying to walk you through a research or like a study that merges between two worlds that do not really match. And those are the worlds of HPC and also SQL databases. So we don't really hear a lot of SQL databases when it comes to HPC, but we wanted to see to what extent we can push the SQL databases and see how they actually manage, especially metadata. Not really the data set itself, but more specifically the metadata. So I just want to mention that this is not really something that we are essentially working on at the Fraunhofer SCAI, but this is just a thought that I had, or like an idea that crossed my mind, and I decided to act on it just to see what the outcomes are, because I was a bit curious. So I don't know if I am in the right position to do that, but I just want to encourage my fellow early career researchers to just act on your research intrusive thoughts. I mean, it might get you somewhere, maybe not, but you're going to learn along the way. So let's get started. So the agenda for this talk is pretty much straightforward. So I'm starting it with presenting the big questions. And why do I want to say big questions? Because the idea itself came to me as a question. So I'm going to talk to you about what this study is actually trying to answer. What are the big questions that we're trying to look at? And then talk a little bit about HPC metadata so that we are all on the same page about what is HPC metadata, what do we mean by HPC metadata, and then talk about the roles of HPC metadata and why is it really important. And this will lay the groundwork for the study, the main core of this presentation. So I'm going to be talking about our work, which is SQL for HPC metadata. And I'm going to talk about the main objectives of the study, the setup, like what is the benchmark pipeline, and then talk about the results, and more importantly, discuss what these results actually mean for HPC, because that's what we're trying to do. And then finally, touch a little bit on some future directions, because one of the main objectives of this study is to open up new perspectives to maybe we can then include we can include SQL databases again into HPC workflows. Who knows? So let's see. Right, so these are my big questions here. So why is metadata in HPC important? Like, why did we really decide to talk about it in this study? While the focus is usually on the computation or the data itself, which means the storage for the most part, but why did we really decide to focus on the metadata? And how is the metadata usually handled? Like, what are the main approaches or formats that are widely used to store and handle metadata? So when I say handle, this means store it, manage it, maybe use it later. So it's all in one. And then the big question, can SQL survive in the wild jungle of HPC? So this is the big question that we're trying to answer today. You can try and guess the answer, but yeah, we can see the exact results in a bit. Right, so HPC metadata, what is it really? So it actually goes without saying that HPC applications and environments, they are constantly evolving and constantly improving. So they literally improve by the day. And when they improve and they evolve, obviously they either consume a lot of data or generate a lot of data. So think of every application that is supposed to be an HPC application. It's literally generating now data that is in unprecedented scales or manners. And it's not only in volume, but it's also in complexity, which makes it more challenging. So, so think about any pipeline run, any parallel job, think about any simulation, and you can see the amount of data that is being generated. But the particularity of this data, so I'm talking here about the data that does not necessarily contribute to the science, but the data that is considered aside. And this data is actually structured. It's usually structured, and that's what we refer to as the metadata in our case. So this structured data obviously needs to be stored properly in a way that keeps its structure, because the structure will be needed later, and it needs to be, we don't really need it to be a bottleneck. That's also the challenge. So we need the good structure, we need a good management, but we also don't want it to be a bottleneck. So despite the increasing importance of this metadata in the HPC systems or the HPC workflows, it is still somehow an afterthought. So it's not really always mentioned or talked about when it comes to HPC environments or applications, and it is usually just stored in some flat files or some loosely formatted JSON files, or sometimes even ad hoc logs that do have very limited searchability, queryability, and sometimes it even makes the integration, or like the automated integration of the workflows, very difficult, if not impossible. So yeah, so the challenge or the problem is that as these applications evolve, become more complex, so the workflows or the workloads become more complex, the data becomes, the data set becomes larger and bigger, so the systems, they also need to cope with that. So they need to cope with that while providing us with a good, I would say, approach to query the data actually, or to do some basic management for the data. So the roles of the metadata, and why do we really need it, or what does it really do, and why do we talk about metadata, right? So the first thing is actually the provenance and the producibility. So it's really important to talk about the lineage of every computation. So we'd like to know, for example, what are the softwares that were used, what are the libraries that were used, what are the versions actually of the whatever software we use to get this specific computation or result. And this is important because at some point we would want to replicate the same results or like the same computations, but on a different cluster. So we would like to get somehow the same results, and we'd also like to sometimes verify the scientific claims. And so for that, we need to have the entire lineage of the calculation that we are talking about. So this allows for the provenance and the producibility. Discovery and cataloging, this is pretty intuitive because the name is actually explaining itself. So this means that we can actually access the metadata through some tags or filters. And it's really interesting for like different research groups if they want to collaborate together, or different research institutions or different project teams. So you can easily see the data that is stored because you have the tags, or you have the flags, or you have some filters to do that. And then we have performance tuning and IO optimization. This actually means that we have to capture some data at runtime. So at runtime, we would like to see, for example, the input and output throughput. We'd like to see the memory usage. We'd like to see even job failure patterns. So something that's going to help us to enter, or like to have some feedback loops. So having feedback loops means we can actually determine bottlenecks and eventually have better performance of the overall system. And then compliance and lifecycle management. So this means that by adhering to some metadata standards, we can actually have some standard ways to do data retention, to do any compliance, basically compliance like rules in this case here. And then finally, collaboration and interoperability. So this means that the data that we are used is actually well labeled, and the metadata is actually openly available, so that if we would like to take this system here, include it in another cluster, or give it to another research group to work with it, they can easily know exactly what goes where, because we have the metadata that is well documented and that is easily manageable. That's still, again, another issue. So metadata in HPC, like what? So here I chose 3 main examples of some large-scale applications that use metadata. So actually, a lot of applications use metadata, but in this case, it's really crucial to know the metadata, to store it properly, and to be able to query it in an efficient manner. So genomic sequencing pipelines. So the scientists, or I refer here mainly to bioinformaticians. So the genomic sequencing pipelines, people who do that, or scientists who do that, they deal with, they want to do like, the sequencing, they want to do some analysis, they want to do some annotations. So for this, they need actually to keep track of their data. So like the sample ID, the sequence ID, the provenance, the sources, even sometimes the versions used for the pipeline itself, the command line, sometimes configurations. So all this, they need to keep it in mind for all the roles that we mentioned before, for the reproducibility, the interoperability, the collaboration, and all that. And for also to, as I said, to be able to reproduce the same results on different systems. And then climate modeling Earth system simulations. So people or scientists who work on climate modeling Earth simulations, they actually do some simulations that span decades. So you can only imagine how many data or how much data is actually involved in their computation. So it's literally petabytes of data. So they also need to keep track of whatever physics, parameters they use. They also need to keep track of their software, what kind of libraries they use and all that. So this also needs to be taken care of. Or when I say taken care of, it's like properly stored to be able to be properly managed afterwards. Because when you get it stored properly, it's easier for you to manage it by in the next steps. And then computational fluid dynamics for aerospace or for any other application. But computational fluid dynamics actually uses a lot of solvers. So you need also to keep track of the solver parameters that you are using in the background. What are their parameters? What are their characteristics? So you really need to know that for you to do any sort of reproducibility, for you to do any sort of, to get feedback maybe about your computation and so on. So I just want to mention here that when you say HPC metadata, some people may think about, so I have a cluster and then I launch my job. So I'm talking about the job ID, I'm talking about the job clock time, I'm talking about the CPU time for the job. So this is still useful metadata, but not for the end users. So when I say the end users, is the scientist who is using my HPC system. So I'm not really talking about the data that's being handled by system admins or other people who are supposed to manage the cluster, but me, as for example, as a bioinformatician or something, how can I handle my metadata for efficient use? So just to make it clear, because the job ID and the job parameters, it can also be referred to as metadata, but we're talking about the metadata from the side of the end user, the scientist in this case. Okay, so what are some of the best practices, or like the popular solutions? So I'm not sure they are the best solutions or like the best practices, but they are famous. Okay, so the first thing, we have HDF5 attributes and CF conventions. So these are like just formats or approaches, basically, to store the metadata, to represent the metadata. HDF attributes, they're basically very well known for HPC systems, and they actually use its hierarchy, so the H stands for hierarchy, and they actually work well with data that manages numbers, like it's good for numerical data. And it's actually very performant because it's very tight to the data. So it allows you to have very high performance IO operations. But the limitation here is that it's not easily queryable. So you cannot do like easy query operations on it, unless you add another, layer to it. But it's not that easy to query the data that's stored under this format. And so that's basically the limitation, but it's still very high performant. And then we have YAML and JSON, also sidecar files. So I want to talk about the sidecar files. So YAML and JSON, they are actually very famous because they are very human readable. So we really like to work with them. And they're also very easy to parse, and very easy to handle, like in a nutshell. But again, the limitation is that the schema definition is actually absent. So there is no schema in it, and which again makes it hard to query and hard to run any search jobs and search operations. And then standard naming schema. So these are basically when you define vocabulary, basically, that you can use among your, in the field, in the same field. And it's really nice to use because it's very intuitive, right? So you just, you use the vocabulary that your field actually agrees on, but this becomes actually an obstacle at some point because it's always requiring the consent of the community. And at some point, it can be like limiting for the evolvement of any field that is actually being used in. So the question, what about a normal SQL database? Okay, so yeah, so SQL databases are not the way to go when it comes to HPC. This is a widely held belief that's been around since we started talking about HPC, basically. And it's not wrong, because SQL databases have proven their limitations when it comes to handling concurrency, basically. And also the scalability is still questionable when it comes to SQL databases. But here's the thing. So the landscape is actually evolving. Right? So we have a lot of advancements also in SQL databases. We have a lot of new techniques that allow you to do better data retrieval or better reads, better writes. So this is exactly what we wanted to push. This is exactly what we wanted to try. So knowing the improvements that are now with SQL databases, can we now talk about SQL databases for HPC, and more specifically for metadata management? So thinking about the improvements, we wanted to say, where is the limit? That's the question that crossed my mind. So the mission is to try to test the performance of the SQL database that we had actually stored on the cloud and see if it can actually perform under HPC workloads. Yeah, so nothing theoretical, no buzzwords, just real data, real workloads, and real results, basically. So it's really important to have something that is empirical. So just reading about it, it's cool, right? But it's also cool to have something that is empirical so that we can have our hands on some numbers, if you want to call it like that. Yeah, so our objectives is to shed the light on the performance of relational databases. That's where it's starting from. And also to see how it scales, if it scales properly. So again, when I say if it scales properly, if it handles this properly, this is quite relative because it depends on the workflow, it depends on the type of application that I'm actually using, but we just wanted to have an idea about the numbers and to also have an idea about the curves. And one of the main objectives, as I mentioned before, is to open the floor to exploring SQL databases for HPC environments, right? So it's, it's still, I don't know, it feels funny to say it, but yeah, you can actually use SQL databases on HPC environments. So yeah, so what you see here, this is our benchmarking pipeline. So it starts with the input data or the input metadata. It's actually synthetic data that represents a bioinformatics application. So we have data related to the sequence ID, we have data related to a timestamp, the provenance, and also the area. So that's exactly the data that we worked on. And then underneath, we have our main storage component, which is a Postgres database that is stored on AWS RDS. And then we have the three main metrics that we wanted to take a closer look at. So obviously the scalability, which means when we increase the number of rows or increase the number of entries, and we also increase the number of clients, which refers to the concurrency, what do we really get? So does it really scale poorly? Do we have good scalability? And so on. And then input and output per second. We wanted also to look into that. And we wanted to look into the latency. And basically here it means the responsiveness. Do we still get a responsive system if we increase the number of rows or the number of entries and also the number of users? And underneath, this is our test bed. It's a basic Python test bed. And I'm going to butcher the name of that library, but it's PsychoPG. It's P for Python and then PG for Postgres. For Postgres. And it's the second version. And then the results and analysis. So all the numbers that we got are then aggregated and visualized so that we can see the trend. So we wanted to see the trend or the curve so that we can have a visual representation of all the three metrics that I mentioned. So this is basically what I explained before. The only thing here is that I didn't really go up to 20 million rows. And you can guess why, because way before that, the results were clear. So we didn't really have to push it to 20 million rows, but we could actually have a good prediction of what would happen if we would go to 20 million rows. But yeah, other than that, it was all the same. Right, so I'm gonna show you, the results in numbers and in graphs, and then I'm gonna go back to summarizing everything. So in the first graph here, as you can see, so this is the latency variation for read and write operations on different data set size. So we have two curves, one for the reads and one for the writes. And as you can see, I mean, the reads are usually less expensive than the writes. So this is by nature. The writes, they take more time. But both of them, they have the same trend, which means at some point, so when we reach the 5,000 rows for the dataset size, we can actually see that the latency started to grow, which is, that's exactly what we wanted to capture. To what extent we can literally empirically notice that the data or that the latency is actually increasing. And then, so as the data set grow, both types of operations slow down significantly, with writes remaining the bottleneck. Because as I explained before, writes are usually more expensive than the reads, because they include a lot of operations in the backend. And then the second graph, this is about the time taken for one read and write operation per client, and it's in function of the number of clients and the time in seconds. So it starts pretty well, right, until it reaches around 60 clients. So by the way, clients for me here, it doesn't really reflect real clients accessing the system, but it means threads. So we use multi-threads to access the database. So when it hits the 60 clients mark, you can clearly see that it starts to go up, and we can clearly see the steep when it reaches 90 clients. So it was relatively well until it reaches the 90 clients. So yeah, latency remained low and stable up to 50, and by increased significantly beyond that point, and it's rising sharply at 60 clients and spiking at 90 and 100 clients. And then the last graph, this is about the scalability. And then for this graph, actually, I just used two dataset sizes. So I didn't really go gradually, but I just used dataset size 1,000 and then dataset size 20,000. So this is exactly what I used for this test here. And of course, the operation, the time per operation and the number of clients. So it's, again, very intuitive to see that the dataset size that is smaller is actually more performant, obviously, and then the one that's bigger is actually less performant. But again, both, they follow the same trend, right? So both, we can clearly see that the scalability is actually, we're losing some scalability when we increase the number of clients, and when we increase also the number of the the size of the data set. So concurrency along with the data set size, this means that we're losing scalability. So I don't even know if I can say losing scalability, but the scalability actually becomes a problem, and the system cannot scale properly anymore. So all in all, so Postgres showed strong performance for moderate scale metadata workloads, moderate to small metadata workloads, and efficiency declined significantly under high concurrency, especially with large data sets. And then this actually is a finding, but it's also a suggestion. So we need to look into ways to accommodate for that, maybe some indexing strategies, or maybe some more, I don't know, like pre-processing of the data before we actually store it so that we can make it easy for the management. And it's also highlighting the importance of resource provisioning and some optimization techniques that needs to be included into the data set, or sorry, into the database itself. Yeah, so here the main question is, okay, so we have now the numbers, we have the findings, we have the curves, but what does it really mean for HPC environments or for HPC systems? When SQL works for small to moderate workloads, when structured metadata is actually required. So if you have a small to moderate workload and you require the structure of the metadata, then you can go to SQL databases. It's going to provide you with the necessary tools to do your management in in an efficient way, and also reproducibility pipelines. So when you care about the reproducibility, again, while having moderate scale workload, you can again go to SQL databases. And it's obviously struggles when we have high frequency writes and when we have massive concurrent clients. So we have a lot of writes, so these are actually already very expensive. And then when we have multiple clients, this again adds to the heaviness of the whole operation itself. So SQL is viable, this is my conclusion, but you need to be aware of the limitations. So you cannot really rely on it to do everything, so you need to be aware of the limitations, and you need to be aware of the different techniques or approaches that you can also apply in order for you to get better performance on the SQL database itself. But we can actually talk about SQL databases for HPC metadata. Yeah, so for my conclusions, so this work is actually benchmarking Postgres on the cloud, and the main idea was to see whether we can actually push it to its limits, and see if it can scale well, and if it can also handle large client groups, basically. So yeah, so the database was hosted on AWS RDS. It's a cloud. It was hosted on the cloud. So we were here talking about a cloud database, and so the results show that the latency increases with higher concurrency and with larger datasets. So as I said, this is probably expected, but it's also good to see the numbers and to see the trend, so we then can expect or predict. The performance of the SQL database if we add more data to our database, or if we add more clients to our system. And again, it's opening the door to more investigations in this direction. Maybe we can add more strategies, as I mentioned before, so that we can have a better performance on the SQL, because we cannot deny that the SQL provides a very nice way to communicate with the data, to query the data. We can do a lot with the SQL languages. But yeah, the problem with the SQL databases and HPC, it's limitations that have been around for a long time now. For future work, again, this is what I was referring to before. We can talk about indexing strategies, partitioning, and caching. We can also talk about the integration with Slurm, for example, and we can also talk about the comparison with NoSQL options. This is not from a performance point of view, but from the user experience point of view. Like as a scientist, for example, a bioinformatician, am I going to have a good experience managing my metadata using an SQL database or using a NoSQL database? And then maybe testing it on a live HPC system, or a hybrid cloud HPC pipeline, like a real one when we have clients actually accessing randomly the database, and we do not really know when it's going to spike and when it's going to be actually performance. So this would be also good, a good study for us. Yeah, so these are basically some of the references that we used for this research, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Any questions?
Thank you for your talk. Obviously, storing metadata is a very broad topic. And have you, we had actually a presentation, I think it was a couple of years ago, about some domain-specific tools to store experiment metadata and track the results and everything. Have you considered or had a look at any of these more domain-specific? Because for life sciences and earth science, they have completely different types of data sets and experiments. So it may be better to have a tool more focused on domains that then you can tune better and provide better performance.
Yeah, it will definitely be better, because if it is more, if it is specific and dedicated to that type of data, it will definitely be better. But the idea here is, can we really bring the SQL databases back into the HPC picture? So that's exactly what I wanted to test here. And so we have databases, SQL databases. We know how to use them. We've been using them for a long time. But then we can no longer talk about them with HPC workloads. But with now the improvements and the advancements that they are, can we really bring them back to but it would be interesting to do a comparison with the existing tools in specific fields. It would give interesting results.
More questions? Okay, thank you so much.
My pleasure.